Hi, I'm Jennifer Palmieri, and this is Just Something About Her, a podcast from the Recount.
We are the labor force. Why are we not saying anything? And it kind of was like, am I going crazy? Like, am I literally just making this up? Because the culture of silence was just so strong.
On this show, we're getting to the bottom of what still holds women back from women who are beating the odds.
This week's guest, Kaiya McCullough.
Welcome to Just Something About Her. Thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
I'm going to start with when we first became aware of your story earlier this summer when there was an article published in the Washington Post where you came forward about abuse from your former coach at the Washington Spirit, Richie Burke. And walk us through what you revealed in that story.
Yeah, so my time at the Spirit was obviously not great. If you've read that article or listened to any of my podcasts, I think, I wasn't even really planning on talking about it again, but I was approached by Molly, the author of the article, and she had kind of come to me and was like, I just kind of heard a situation that happened at the club under similar circumstances and kind of just wanted to get my opinion about it. And from there, I kind of word vomited everything that happened to me. It was the first time I had talked about it to anybody besides my parents and family or my therapist. Basically, what I divulged was that there was this really horrible culture of intimidation and bullying and psychological abuse happening, verbal abuse happening to players, and also some very racially insensitive incidents that happened while I was there, me being a Black woman, which felt very targeted.
There are other players who corroborated what you said, but you were the only player that actually went on the record. Was that a conscious decision for you to do that? Why did you decide to do that, to attach your name and be public about this?
It was a conscious decision. I wasn't going to do it at first, actually, but Molly made me feel secure enough to put my name to it. That decision was it would lend more legitimacy to the article if somebody was on the record for it. And I knew that there wasn't going to be anybody else who went on the record. Some players were still playing and didn't want to risk, jeopardizing their careers for fear of retaliation. I knew that, my path has kind of gone in a different direction, and I really wasn't concerned about playing again or, impressing anybody in the NWSL or in the soccer world for that matter. I really had nothing to lose and everything to gain by being able to make sure that justice was served.
So you were drafted by the Spirit in January of 2020, and you said that the abuse started almost immediately, mostly to the less experienced players, which I find, that's very telling to me that the coach picks on the less experienced players. And you said that you could only describe it as feeling personal. What do you mean by that, and how did it change the way that you felt about yourself and the sport?
Yeah, it was, this culture, again, I use the words intimidation and bullying. I think it was targeted at people who were on the lower half of the team, who were in more vulnerable positions, who were more expendable. Because I feel like, we had more to prove, we had more to lose. Our contracts weren't really super secure. So, when I'm looking back on it, of course they're going to pick on these people because they can't stand up for themselves and they don't have the power to be able to fight back. In regards to it being personal, it felt like, he would pick one person for a practice and would just kind of berate them the whole time. Like, even if they were doing something that was like okay or good, it just was never good enough. Or if they did something bad, it felt like it was the end of the world, and it was just constant. When somebody hones in on you and won't stop and won't let up, that's what makes it feel personal.
This coach is an older coach. It's like this has been tolerated in his career, accepted in his career for decades.
Yeah, I had a lot of people message me privately on Twitter, on Instagram, through email, basically saying that he coached them when they were like youth players in high school, and it was the same exact thing, and that they were still kind of dealing with some of the repercussions of being treated like that. And so, talking about the culture of at least my team, and I feel like what happens a lot probably in women's sports is like, in our instance, like everybody would see it, everybody knew what was happening, and yet nobody could say anything. And so being in an environment like that, I would be like looking around and being like, how are we not, we have the power here. I don't understand why, like, we are the labor force. Why are we not saying anything? And it kind of was like, am I going crazy? Like, am I literally just making this up? Because the culture of silence was just so strong.
And I know on your podcast Unfiltered, you had an episode where you talked about the abuse in the story at length, and you talked about how the abuse created a hierarchy on the team between the newbies and those who were the star players. And you said this, what I thought was really profound.
People in power rely on lack of solidarity in order to maintain power.
Right. This is like one of the biggest things. I think if you could point to one factor that I think holds women back, it's pitting women against each other. How did that dynamic where you're relying on the lack of solidarity to maintain power, how did that pitting women against each other, how did that play out in the field, in the locker room?
It's interesting that you say that, because I feel like in a lot of ways sports are a microcosm for society, and a lot of the values that we see reflected in sports are a direct result or a direct mirror of where we are as a society. And so I feel like through this whole experience, I've gotten a crash course in power dynamics, labor relations, sexism, racism, like the whole everything. And I described it as a hierarchy, and it wasn't necessarily, like anybody was treating each other differently. Everybody was friends on the team for the most part. And I wouldn't say that there was like a direct, like personal kind of tension between people on the team off the field. But on the field, it certainly was just known that those that were, in the top 14 people, top 13 people, like weren't going to get the same treatment. And I think that sort of inherently created, again, this tension that was really hard to get past. And I think it definitely created a lot of weird dynamics, for lack of a better word, on the team.
Have you seen the flip side of that with the solidarity that you've experienced since coming forward with these allegations against your coach?
Yeah, I mean, it's great now to see solidarity. I guess that goes into bigger questions about what kind of solidarity is meaningful and whether it's true and genuine. If it's only solidarity that happens after the fact, what does that say about it? I don't know. Those are some of the questions that I've been pondering. I can't help but feel betrayed in a lot of ways. That it took me, quitting the sport and essentially being brave enough to come forward to get support. I shouldn't have had to suffer in order to get support from people. I shouldn't have had to quit to get support from people. People should have been standing up anyways. I think, looking at the bigger picture and realizing that now that there is a solid foundation of solidarity in place, we are going to be able to move forward a lot quicker, a lot stronger, a lot more efficiently. So it's kind of a mixed bag of feelings for me about the whole solidarity thing. We live in this white supremacist, patriarchal society. That power dynamic is automatically going to translate over to sport.
There was another bombshell story about the league with the former North Carolina Courage coach Paul Riley was leveraging his position of authority to lure players into his bed, to coerce them into sex, to force women to kiss each other, for his viewing pleasure. And he was fired along with the commissioner. I mean, this kind of the abuse that's been revealed sort of league-wide is pretty stunning.
Yeah. I think that's why I use the word betrayed, is because there were so many decisions and, I don't know, actions by people in power that got us to the point that we were at, and yet nobody did anything to help me or others. This is a pervasive issue, not only in this particular league, but in the sport and in women's sports, as we've seen over and over and over and over again. So the fact that people just kind of choose to ignore these situations, not necessarily those being, not necessarily victims, but those who are in positions of power that are just choosing to kind of turn a blind eye to everything that's happening, is a really, really frustrating realization to happen. And I think that's why, a lot of people are calling for these really strong no tolerance policies for abuse or people who enabled abuse. And, I think that's a way forward, because how do you trust people who created a system that was so corrupt? How do you trust those people to reform that system?
So there are 10 teams in the National Women's Soccer League, and only 2 are coached by women. One of those is an interim coach. That's what we refer to as a glass cliff situation, where you put a woman in a job to do the job, but you don't fully empower her. But that's a different subject. Flag that. It happens a lot. You see this, it happens a lot when you put in as interim jobs. And then the Washington Spirits coach was fired because of the allegations you and others made about his abusive behavior. And you said
after an investigation. After an investigation.
Yeah, that's important to know. You have said that
at the end of the day, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about men coaching non-men.
It automatically creates this power dynamic. He can quite literally control their contracts, their living, their apartment, their paychecks, their food. Share some of those, what those thoughts and feelings are.
In, my time, the situations where I've had a male coach instantly creates a different dynamic, because, again, if we're talking about sports as a microcosm for society, that inherent power dynamic that exists between men and women and non-men in society, we live in this white supremacist, patriarchal society. That power dynamic is automatically going to translate over to sport. And then when you, on top of that already existing power structure, then give men more power to then basically have unilateral control over the lives of women and non-men, it can corrupt. Power can corrupt.
One of the allegations you made against your former coach was that he was racially abusive to you and the only other black player that was on the team. And in your podcast, you describe microaggressions, and I think this is the best definition in terms of how it feels that I've heard someone say.
It's hard to explain if you're not a minority, how difficult it is to be in a space where you feel as if your value as a human is being joked about.
It's tough, because I think you were talking about earlier how you kind of want to put on this tough facade and, act like it doesn't get to you. But those sorts of things, especially when you've been hearing them your entire life and you've been hearing people joke about you and your culture, when people are making light of all the trauma that you and your family and your generations and generations of ancestors have suffered for the sake of a joke, it's very belittling. It's very hurtful, and that word doesn't do it justice. But I think, again, it's hard to kind of describe that feeling if you aren't a racial minority, if you aren't a minority in this society that we have. But repeated jokes that are, especially the fact that they're kind of played off as, oh, I didn't mean anything by it. And then a lot of times with microaggressions, I feel like gaslighting kind of accompanies it. So you're well, you're just making a big deal out of it, nothing. I didn't mean it like that. So then the blame is then put back onto you for feeling a certain type of way about it. I think it's a really complex, and I like the word insidious, form of racism. And I think, in today's age, it's a much more common one. So I think the way in which these microaggressions and these more covert forms of racism have kind of slithered their way in to our culture in a way that is really harmful to people of color, and especially Black people. So it was definitely interesting having to deal with that, and act like it didn't bother me on the surface, as to not make waves, as to not lose my contract, as to keep my living.
You ultimately left the NWSL in September 2020 because you knew you needed to take care of your mental and emotional well-being above your career. And your story definitely brings to mind stories of Simone, Biles, Naomi, Osaka. What did it feel like for you watching their journeys this past summer?
I was so happy for them. I was so proud of them because, obviously not to their level, but being an elite athlete is a really, really difficult job. And being a woman on top of that, and being a Black woman on top of that, that intersection is a really, really intense one. And, sometimes it feels like you are literally getting harmed from all angles, especially with them, and on top of them being Black women, being dark-skinned Black women. So, you have colorism, you have sexism, you have racism, you have, just the fact that they are at the top of their game, the elite of the elite. So they're already being extra scrutinized in a world that doesn't like seeing Black women succeed. I couldn't help but feel so much relief for them and so much pride that they were able to prioritize their mental health. And it kind of reaffirmed that I made the right choice for me. And I don't know, I just wish nothing but peace to them, because I saw how much better my life got when I prioritized my mental health, how much happier I am now, how many more opportunities I have, how much more fulfilled I am. And it all started with a decision to prioritize myself.
I want to ask you about the Black Women's Players Collective. So first of all, just note for the audience that 2021 was a record year for recruiting Black women in the NWSL, 6 of the top 10 picks. But just a decade ago, the 2011 World Cup team fielded just one Black woman on a roster of 23. So tell us about the Black Women Players Collective and what that organization is asking of the NWSL.
Yeah, they're doing really incredible work, and it really formed out of the need for a safe space for Black players within the league in the midst of all the turmoil of 2020, the COVID pandemic, the sort of racial reckoning that happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. There really wasn't, a lot of resources for Black players in the league to deal with this. Again, I was being asked at practice to, leave all that stuff off the field and just focus on playing when you're Black in America, that's not something you can do. You can't, just magically erase the trauma and the things that you have to go through being Black in America for the sake of performing some sort of job. The collective was really born out of a need to have a safe space for Black players. And in terms of the work that they're doing now, really just creating more access for young Black players, creating more representation or more visible representation for young Black players and for Black players across the globe. Growing up, I didn't really have very many Black players to look up to. There are a few, even then they weren't celebrated or glorified in the same way that many white players were. And they were just as instrumental in building the sport, but you don't really hear about their stories. So to see that Black women in the league are reclaiming their power and rewriting the narrative about what it means to be a Black female soccer player is a really cool thing to witness. As much as we want to glamorize sports and see it as entertainment, these are workers, and this is a labor force, and this is an exploited labor force, and exploited labor forces need unions.
So, one of the points that you made was that when you were on the Spirit, it was difficult because your livelihood depended on your very meager salary there. And many of the players are really living on the margins because the pay is so poor. And so that makes you particularly vulnerable to the kinds of abuse that from coaches. So I want to talk about how pay actually affects your safety and security in the sport, and start with some of the pretty appalling statistics about pay at the NWSL. Its minimum player salary is $22,000, and its maximum player salary is $52,500 for the 2021 season. The NWSL Players Association estimates that a third of their player association members make the league's minimum salary, $22,000, and about 75% make $31,000 or less. To contrast this with how men are paid, the average player in Major League Soccer earns $398,725 for the 2021 season. Can you tell us what you're making when you're hired as a new player for the Washington Spirit?
Yeah, the minimum salary plus they pay for your apartment, but still very, very meager.
Still, it's like $20,000.
Yeah. Very meager living. Most players who have worked through high school and college and then now professional, and who have only been able to commit time to playing your sport. I know, in college, we weren't really allowed to have a job outside of training and outside of our sport because it affected our training hours. Most people in this workforce don't have outside experience to get jobs that are more traditional, like corporate or 9 to 5. So even I was joking about how I'm applying to law school and my resume is so thin just because my whole life has been kind of committed to coaching and to playing.
I'm interested in your take about this. I always hear this argument when I complain on Twitter, which has a really big impact. It's really meaningful. But when I complain on Twitter about and women's soccer is the best example because the women's national team is so good, about the women being played. Yes, it's pointed out to me, usually by men, that the problem is that the men's sports bring in more money than the women's sports do. And I was like, yes, I am aware that we built the market to value men's efforts over women's. I know that we've been indoctrinated over the course of all of human history, sent signals every single day that men are to be valued more than women, and that reveals itself in how much money women's sports brings in versus men's sports. But what's your response to that argument that men's sports brings in more money?
I think you put it very, very well. You have to look at these larger systems in play, because I think it's foolish to say that, women's sports don't have the earning potential. Investing in women's sports is not something that's just going to financially drain resources if we put equal amount of resources into it.
At college, start with college, right? Start with high school, put the same amount of resources in.
Yeah, I think viewership for, the NWSL, for the WNBA has skyrocketed in the past year. And so I think it's remiss to say that, investing in women's sports just isn't going to earn money. We have, for how many years, put the value of men's sports over women's sports and created this narrative that, women's sports are less entertaining, women's sports are less fun, women's sports are less cool. So, of course, that's what's going to reflect in our cultural consciousness. Of course, that's how it's going to be.
Do you have a sense that unions could be an answer here?
Definitely. I think, the PA is negotiating their first collective bargaining agreement with the league, which I think is going to be a big step, because when you think about everything that happens, like, there was not an anti-harassment policy in place when I was playing, which is only a year ago. So, these are basic sort of protections that you need to have in place, because at the end of the day, like, as much as we want to glamorize sports and see it as entertainment, these are workers, and this is a labor force, and this is an exploited labor force, and exploited labor forces need unions. And so, going back to kind of what I said, I feel like I had this crash course in labor relations, in gender equity, in racism, sexism. So I think
in a year, all in a year.
I know, crash course 101, just, play professional sports, kids. That's how you learn.
Thank you for doing this. It's been really great to talk with you.
Of course. Thanks for having me. This has been amazing.